Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Małgorzata Mazurek. I'm teaching East Central European history and chairing Polish studies at Columbia University. It's a big pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank again Jonathan Brandt and Alex Weiser from YIVO for organizing this wonderful one-day symposium, and Magda Teter from Fordham University. So I have a big pleasure to introduce very briefly our four panelists. As you see, the extensive bios are in your program. Our first speaker will be Professor Irena Grudzińska-Gross, who is currently professor in the Institute of Slavic Studies at the Polish Academy of Science and a Guggenheim Fellow. She taught across the United States in places like NYU, Boston, Princeton. She has co-authored Golden Harvest with Jan Tomasz Gross and many other books in history and literary studies. Our second speaker is Professor Erika Lehrer, who is a social cultural anthropologist and curator, and she's an associate professor in the departments of history, sociology, and anthropology at Concordia University in a happy country called Canada. And she has she organized many wonderful exhibits, including souvenir talisman toy about Jewish figurines in Polish culture, and more recently, Terribly Close, Polish vernacular artists face the Holocaust, which took place in the Krakow Ethnographic Museum. Her book publications are for you to read in the program. The next speaker is Professor Magda Teter, who is chairing Judaic Studies at Fordham University, and I would like to just make a brief announcement of her forthcoming book entitled Blood Libel: On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, which is forthcoming this year in Harvard University Press. And our fourth reader is Katrin Stoll, who is a fellow at the moment at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University in Berlin. And she, maybe most notably for today's meeting at YIVO, she's a member of the research group Early Modes of Writing the Shoah, Practices of Knowledge and Practices of Jewish Survivors in Europe. Ladies, the floor is yours, and I look forward to your papers and discussion afterwards.
Good evening. I'm sorry I was late. There was a general conviction that it cannot start on time. So because of the morning and so on. So this is my excuse. I'm very happy that my talk will continue some of the topics that were already mentioned this morning, especially by Jonathan Brandt and by some other people in this wonderful panel in the morning. I am not very happy that my topic is not very much in dialogue, so to say, because what I'm presenting is something that is very one-sided. That is, I'm talking about the concept, the stereotype of Żydokomuna, which combines the conspiracy theories, anti-communism, and racist anti-Semitism. The idea it presents is quite clear. Communism has been invented and implemented by Jews to serve their interests. The term belongs to an ensemble of anti-Semitic concepts, all of them based on the conviction that Jews are an alien people, conspiring in various ways to the detriment of others. We have to remember that the word itself, Żydokomuna, is a term of abuse It's an insult, not a neutral noun. It is best translated not as Judaeo-communism, as it was translated, for example, by Brandt, or by another polite version like Judeo-Bolshevism. But it should be rather translated like similarly to what the Polish scholar Anna Zawadzka did in her article on that topic as commie Jews or some such. I will talk about the history of that concept, about its influence on recent history, and about its status today. Though there are very few Jews in Poland today, and no communists that I know of, the concept is alive and well. Some of you may remember a book by Paul Lendway, which was called Anti-Semitism Without the Jews, Communism in Eastern Europe. It was published in 1971. Such book today would have a title, Judeo-communism without Jews and without communists. The history of the concept, the Żydokomuna, is unfortunately long and rich, and it has a very large bibliography. There's also a long tradition of refuting and debating the tenets of this concept, showing that only a minority of Jews were attracted to communism. Only a limited number of Jews worked in the communist political police, that it was systemic anti-Semitism that made communism seem to some Jews like a solution to discrimination. I will not do anything of the sort. The stereotype's function does not consist in a description of reality, but in imposing upon it an a priori idea or a vision. The polemics with a stereotype would assume that it is based on reality and that the holders of such views are open to be convinced. It is good for historians to debate the involvement of the Polish population in the leftist movements, in Poland, for example, or in other countries. But one has to be clear that it is not the Jews that caused the creation of that stereotype. So we'll talk a little bit about history. In historical literature, the origins of this particular strand of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic stereotypes are placed immediately after the Russian Revolution, as Jonathan Bent already and our organizer also mentioned, that it's just after the Russian Revolution. And because the revolution gave Jews the right to participate in public realm. The stereotype was fully functional in Poland during the Polish-Russian War of 1920, and even before, in the 1918 series of pogroms on historically Polish territories. Professor William Hagen, in his book about the anti-Jewish violence in these territories in the years 1914-1920, dates the fear of Judeo-Bolshevism even earlier. The stereotype was one of the declared motivations for the eruptions of ethnic violence directed against Jewish population during World War I and the first period of Polish state independence. It was a period of great uncertainty, but later, in the independent Poland, the concept of Żydokomuna continued to flourish, especially after the death of Józef Piłsudski. Communism was then a political choice associated in the public mind with loyalty towards the Soviet Union and disloyalty to Poland. The use of term Żydokomuna delegitimized both Jews and communism. It made both Jews and communism alien. Joining the two terms indicated that the Jews were not accepted as co-citizens and that citizenship had an ethnic connotation. The Jews were conceived of as a unit with no diversity of opinion and no rights that belong to co-nationals. Let me make the only, I think, exception that I make as far as the numbers and statistics go, that to show that the association of all Jews with communism never had any base in social reality, including the period between the two world wars. In 1928, only 7% of Polish citizens of Jewish origin, that is those who designated themselves in the census or in the elections as Jews, voted for communists, 7%, while the remaining 93% voted for other parties, 49% for Piłsudski. Now, the question is 7% a lot? It is not certain if even zero support for communism by the Polish Jewish population would debunk the stereotype. Today, when in Poland there are no communists, few Jews, and Russia is back to its pre-revolutionary self, the stereotype is flourishing like in the late 1930s. The anti-Bolshevik slogans were used as a pretext for the violence that erupted in occupied Poland at the beginning of World War II. I'm talking about the Easter pogroms of March 1940 in Warsaw and Krakow. These pogroms were organized by the National Radical Organization, now active again, and were triggered by the blood libel, but the false story about a Christian child killed by Jews who needed blood and so on. You know it. But the violence was also justified, in quotation marks, by the association of Jews with Bolsheviks. This was one of the slogans that made these pogroms patriotic. This is 1940 in Warsaw, though they were approved by the German occupier. At that time, that occupier, by the way, was allied with the Bolsheviks themselves. The same explanation was given a year later in the case of Jedwabne, which was just one in a chain of similar pogroms in at least 30 localities in the region previously occupied by the Soviets. The stereotype of Judeo-communism served then as a pretext for the indiscriminate murder, rape, and pillage of civilian population, Jewish children included. The same elements, fear of conspiracy, of communism, of Jews' supposed need for Christian children's blood, of the ritual murder, formed the ensemble of anti-Semitic ideas functioning in Poland immediately after World War II. The hoax of blood label was a direct trigger for the Krakow pogrom of 1945, for several attacks on groups of Jews in other places, and of course, for the 1946 pogrom in Kielce. There, too, anti-communism had a patriotic tone. By being against Jews, one was defending the nation and tradition. The slogan of Żydokomuna was a call for arms. In her new, already mentioned here, definitive book on Kielce pogrom, Joanna Tokarska-Bakir proved that there was no communist or Soviet provocation leading to that concrete case of violence against Jews. But in their effort to win popular support, communists themselves used the stereotype of Żydokomuna. Here, the best example is the so-called dry pogrom, to use the expression of Adam Michnik, of 1968. As you remember, in March 1968, university students, young workers, and intelligentsia rebelled and went to the streets. The authorities repressed the rebellion, claiming that it was their patriotic duty. But since they were communists, their patriotism had to be nuanced. Traditional Polish patriotism is anti-German and anti-Russian. The authorities excelled in anti-Germanness, but it was not so easy for them to be anti-Russian. In their propaganda, they created an internal division between good and bad communists and between good and bad students. The government propaganda described the students organizers as troublemakers, manipulated and used by old Stalinists who wanted to return to power. In short, a conspiracy of bad communists. The bad Stalinists and student organizers were Zionists, which was a way to say Jews. The non-Zionist protesting students were thus unwitting instruments in the hands of malignant agents. This was a creative way to use an adapted version of Żydokomuna to avoid attacking non-Jewish students and communism itself. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Today, the 1968 events are also interpreted with the use of the concept of Żydokomuna. One of the triggers of the March turmoil was an internal Communist Party conflict between the younger apparatchiks and their older comrades, blocking the young ones' path to advancement. The present authorities consider these events as an internal communist fight. Such an interpretation allows them to reject the ownership of whole blocks of recent history. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said as much in March 2018 while commemorating 1968 at Warsaw University. The persecutions of students, the anti-Semitic purges, the forced emigration of people of Jewish origin were due to the Communist Party actions to a body external to the Polish people. This is what he said. It was not the action of the Polish nation. One could say that it was the Jews, the Żydokomuna that expelled themselves from Poland. Such externalizing of responsibility leads to othering of a gigantic part of Polish 20th century history, the period of 1939 to 1989, when the communists lost power, 1989, or even from 1939 to 2015, when the present authorities came to power. These years became an epoch, these years 1939-2015, became an epoch of German and Russian occupations. And the map, there are consequences for it. For example, the fact that it is absolutely forbidden to say Oświęcim, as it used to be, the Oświęcim Brzezinka. Now you have to say Auschwitz-Birkenau. You cannot say what was said to Łódź ghetto. You have to say Richmondstadt, and so on. There is a language, there's a map, new map being built of this new history. And these 50 and even 75 years of unfreedom are also conceived of as time of continuous resistance to German communist and post-communist occupations. Two regimes, Nazi and Soviet, are equal as totalitarian, and the story of anti-fascism is being replaced by that of anti-communism, which was shown here in the analysis of the 1998 law about Institute of National Memory. Yes, that basically anti-fascism is being abandoned and is replaced by anti-communism, that the Nazis and occupation are less important than anti-communism as a kind of the axis of the political history. Since the communist system is assumed to have been completely alien to the Polish people, these millions upon millions of party members are now seen as its victims. Also, most of anti-Jewish activities are interpreted as a defense against or fending off of communism. The indefensible Kielce pogrom is a Jewish communist provocation. The immediate post-war killings of the Jewish survivors are explained as part of a fight against communism. This is the form in which the concept of Żydokomuna is used, functions today. The heroes of the current government propaganda are the members of the post-war anti-communist underground, the so-called doomed soldiers or cursed soldiers, żołnierze wyklęci. These were men who did not interrupt their fight after the end of the war. They usually paid for that with their lives or long prison sentences. Their activity, now quite well researched, were often on the border of banditry, especially dangerous to Jews. Yet they are today the main protagonists of the so-called affirmative patriotism of the governing party. And here I have a quote from historian Marek Jan Chodakiewicz, but I don't have to quote it because this only confirms what I just said. He says that, he says basically, maybe I'll read it. The quote is the following: "The anti-Semitism of Polish resistance fighters was not the main motive for the murders of Jews. To describe the communist and Soviet enemies, the Polish resistance underground was using the term Żydokomuna, referring to a Jewish communist conspiracy, and therefore expressing anti-communism in an anti-Semitic sense. According to them, the only real Poles were the anti-communists." Indeed, there is a gigantic effort now, supported by numerous government institutions, to change the pattern of research history, the patterns. As I already mentioned, the axis of the anti-fascism, which united communists and non-communists, is now completely abandoned. Anti-communism has become the main axis of Polish history. That change is presented in a return to the real Polish tradition of honor, victimhood, and sacrifice. And the doomed soldiers are to illustrate all three of these characteristics. The new history is not a history of all Polish citizens, but an ethnic and polemical kind, a reply to real or perceived dangers and humiliation. It is especially sensitive to any criticism, however minor. And here I was talking about this new law that has been already discussed, which I don't have to go into. That is the history, the law last year voted just in time for this 50th celebration of 1968 event. The law that planned to criminalize anyone who publicly or untruthfully assigns responsibility of or co-responsibility to the Polish nation or the Polish state for Nazi crimes and the Ukrainian crimes as well. So we were already heard about this law, so I'm not going to go into it. Then I'm talking about several institutions, new institutions that are working on creating and preserving this new history, which is in a way the new identity effort. And sorry, and again, I will not talk a lot about it because I was talking about the Institute of National Memory, which has been discussed already, and with this. By the way, on the 25th of April, the Institute of National Memory, its educational center in Warsaw, planned a conference called Jews in the Ministry of Security, temporarily cancelled because of the illness of one of the panelists. Then another institute is the new Pilecki Institute. That, again, I'm not going to describe it, but it's a gigantic institution which many multiple functions, educational, and which has a lot of funds for research, and which is also has a right to propose to the president a new medal recognizing virtue and fraternity. Also, the Minister of Culture is very much involved in this effort to build new history in various museums and in kind of reorganizing the ones that exist already and building the new ones, including the Museum of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Warsaw, which the Minister of Culture, Piotr Gliński, said will be the museum which will show 800 years of love of the Polish and Jewish nations. So looking forward to it. And, and now I would like to ask Alex to show something, a photograph that I have that I didn't want to, I didn't want to have this photograph all throughout my presentation because I thought that will distract you from the content of it. Anyhow, this is a photograph of a little town named Pruchnik on Easter Friday, probably in 1942. I found this photograph in the virtual shtetl, so there's the origin of this photograph is given there too. And before I start to talk about it, I'm going to say that the tone of all of these changes that are done into the Polish, how Polish history was presented even very recently, have been described by a scholar, a Polish scholar, Elżbieta Janicka, as kind of Holocaustization of Polish suffering. She described like that, with that word, the everyday language of Polish politics. The already quoted Minister of Culture complained in an interview that the governing party is treated by the opposition media like Jews were treated by Goebbels. The same language was used by a representative of the Polish Catholic Church at a press conference about pedophilia. The Archbishop Marek Jędraszewski said the church is against the rigid punishing of priests pedophiles, which would be treating them like, and here I quote, the Hitlerian Nazism when it fought against Jews, from which the Holocaust appeared, powstał. And also, this was the end of the quotation, with the usual symmetry Nazi Bolshevik, he said, I'm quoting, the Bolshevik system, which treated the enemies of the people, which led to tens of thousands and perhaps many millions of victims. These are just two quotations from very many cases of this kind of continuous use of Second World War, a reference to the victimhood of people who are criticized. But the scandals are not only in the language. And now let me say about just a few events of the last, basically of the last year, but I would start with the 2016 burning of an effigy of Jew in Wrocław. And the person who performed the burning declared that the figure represented George Soros. A few months ago, a periodical went on its cover a kind of an explanatory page with photos of how to recognize a Jew was found in the kiosk of the Polish parliament. It was banned from there, but its distributor, Ruch, refused to remove it from its offerings, from its catalog. Another case, a special media hate attack met the American ambassador's best wishes for Passover, for happy Passover. And on Good Friday, and this is where this photo, why this photo is here, in a little township named Pruchnik, the ceremony of dragging, beating, hanging, dismembering, burning, and drowning an effigy of Judas was performed with the enthusiastic participation of children, given stick and encouraged by men who organized the event. And the Judas had the side curls and head covered of a Jew, and not to mention a gigantic red nose, looking like a red tie, which traditionally adorned a figure of Judas on such occasions, indicating that the Jew was also a communist. It had 2019 written on the chest, and the children were encouraged to add more hits and kicks because of the supposed recent Jewish demands on property return. And the last case that I want to mention is that just on Tuesday of last week, on April 30th, in Łódź, a man hanged a Jew. This is what he said. I'm hanging a Jew. I hanged a Jew. An effigy to which he applied a face of Jakub Berman, a communist, on a gallows adorned with a sign of swastika, so combining all the possible stereotypes together. This was positioned in front of a, I think, police station, and that it was not disturbed. So I'm not going to talk about Pruchnik because I became very kind of fixated. You know, there's a video of that event, which you can see on internet. But this list that I gave you was a list of physical attacks on symbolic Jews. These are not living Jews. There are, of course, no agglomerations of visibly Jewish people in Poland today. And according, again, this will be my second numbers moment. According to the Polish Ministry of Interior, actually there's according to 2011 census, the last census, there's 7,353 Jews in Poland. That is, people who declare themselves to be Jews. The Jews, however, did not disappear from the public life, or rather supposed Jews, American Jews, symbolic Jews, like Judas. The same can be said of communists. The fascist organization marched in Polish cities with slogans against them. Communism forms a framework for the speeches of the entire spectrum of parties and movements. The best illustration of this ideology of anti-communism is Prime Minister Morawiecki's, again, homage to the soldiers of Brygada Świętokrzyska, a Second World War military formation that collaborated with the Nazis in the extermination of the Jews and left Poland together with the escaping German army in 1945. In such a way, the politics of today's authorities are spectrally based on two mirrored pillars, communist and Jewish. These symbolic presences meet with symbolic violence. So far, so good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers of this event. It's really an honor to participate. I was asked to speak on the theme of the presence and absence of Jews and Jewishness in post-war Polish culture. And when I sat down to think about the ways that this theme intersected with my own work as a cultural anthropologist and a curator, it became clear that presence and absence are more complicated than they seem at first glance. And I found my mind going to comparative cases in different national contexts and theoretical issues emanating from my own discipline, like the agency asserted by the material world and how the body holds memory. And I also thought about practical and political challenges that I've been confronting in my recent work making exhibitions and intervening in existing museum displays in Poland to use material objects to stimulate dialogue around difficult issues of Polish Jewish history, memory, and representation. This preamble is meant as a bit of a roadmap so you will understand, or at least sort of hang on, while I will be beginning a bit radically far afield from the topic at hand, but I promise that I will work my way pretty quickly back to Poland, and then I will zoom in on a few specific awkward museum objects that I've been working with there. And I hope that you'll leave with some new ways to think about the topic of presence and absence that will at least partially fulfill the task of addressing this very rich theme. So if that was a roadmap, this is a real map. And with this map, I'd like to begin once again with a territorial acknowledgement. A territorial acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from homelands and territories on which an institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. And while I understand that territorial acknowledgements are still rather unconventional in New York City institutions, they are traditional within indigenous communities, and they're also quite conventional in Canada, where I live and teach. And this is particularly true in the academy and other institutions that feel an ethical obligation to push back against the kinds of silencing of marginalized voices and histories that help to sustain idealized myths and avoid hard truths of our own national identities and histories, which I think is very much relevant to our topic. So based on my admittedly very limited research, I'd like to acknowledge that the area of Manhattan where YIVO is located was part of the traditional territory of the Lenape Nation. Like many other indigenous groups, in the face of European colonizers, the Lenape fought, made treaties, were ultimately pushed out or forced to assimilate. Their descendants today live mostly on reservations in southwest Ontario, although some are still currently petitioning the US government for recognition of formal tribal status. My acknowledgement today is a small gesture towards dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, I might have done this territorial acknowledgement regardless of what topic I was speaking about, but it seemed particularly significant in relation to the topic at hand, the issue of post-genocidal presence and absence. I hope that starting this way today helps awaken us to some of the complexities of the question of what it means for a cultural group to be present or absent in a social context and at a political moment. I recently returned from Washington, D.C., where I visited the National Museum of the American Indian. Native Americans make up just over 1% of the US population, about 5 million people, which is about the same as Jews in this country. But as the museum's new exhibit titled Americans illustrates, images and names of Indians are everywhere. From advertising to corporate logos to military weaponry. How is it, the exhibit asks, that Native Americans can be both so present and so absent in American life at once? The holiday of Thanksgiving itself, argues curator Paul Chatt-Smith, is a holiday whose thinly veiled purpose is an attempt to come to terms with the fact that the American national project came at a great and often brutal expense to Native people. Vast swaths of Americans today have never met an Indian, but this exhibit shows that Native Americans are powerfully present in all of our lives, in the very fabric of the nation, as mythological creatures available for all manner of psychological needs and projections. The situation of Jews in Poland gives us a similar problematic to contend with. It's a very different history, of course, and I want to be clear that my goal is in no way to collapse these two cases. But the issue of presence and absence, of remembering and forgetting, is tangled up with place and nostalgia and tradition and trauma and injustice in equally complex ways in the two cases. And Jews, I suggest, are equally deeply rooted in the Polish national psyche as indigenous people are in Americas, a highly significant other. So I'm hoping perhaps these two cases can simply illuminate each other and also perhaps make us feel responsible in different ways, or think about what it means actually to feel responsible. So now turning directly to Poland and Jews. The most obvious way to think about Jewish presence and absence in Poland is, of course, the basic human dimension. Here we're faced, of course, with the radical demographic diminution of actual Jews in post-war Poland, as we know, and of course, as many of the specifics have been detailed by my esteemed colleagues in the previous panel. After the Holocaust, the remaining presence of Jews in Poland was challenged by a broad spectrum of pressures. For the approximately 260,000, or about 8% of Polish Jews who survived, these pressures ranged from the simple desire to escape the site of their recent genocidal victimization and their family and civilizational loss, to general hostility and violent attacks by individual townspeople unwelcoming to the Jews' return, to the larger Kielce pogrom in 1946. According to historian Antoni Polonsky, by 1950, some 180,000 Jews had left the country, most of them for Israel, leaving in 1955 an estimated 72,000 to 80,000 Jews. Anti-Semitic government incitement in 1956 led to another wave of emigration, leaving between 22,000 and 35,000 Jews by the late 1960s. This, along with the shrinking and increasingly feeble support for and the constricted definition of Jewish communal life by the government of the Polish People's Republic, made living Jewishly, in any traditional sense, all but impossible. The government's sponsored anti-Zionist campaign of 1968 pushed about 15,000 more Jews to leave, which many observers understood as the end of 1,000 years of the history of Jews in Poland. But Jewishness remained in Poland despite the disappearance of Jews. One can see this in the deep imprint on Polish culture in everything from music to artistic crafts to foodways. I was shocked on my first trip to Poland as a college student in 1990 when I discovered that Catholic Poles eat Jewish-style carp on Christmas Eve. But I was also struck by the cultural familiarity of a place that had never been mentioned as my own, despite having had 4 Polish Jewish grandparents. During my doctoral fieldwork, I met many American, Argentinian, Israeli, and other Jews who were similarly taken aback during their visits to Poland on discovering how Polish they suddenly realized their parents had been. They recognized this in the smallest embodied gestures by everyday Poles, like a turn of phrase, the manner in which people greet each other, or how a waitress in a Krakow cafe folded a napkin. Jewishness can seem to be everywhere in Poland. But I'd like to focus today on the category of material culture, as it's in this domain that Jewishness and Jews' absence and presence have been most interestingly and ambivalently related to one another, and have arguably been the most potently felt. If Jews themselves were awkward objects in post-war Poland, trying to fit into a reforming and reformulating nation that could not manage to make a habitable space for them, the concrete physical infrastructure and detritus of the long Jewish communal sojourn in Poland was a fact that remained, a kind of proxy for the diminishing human population that had given rise to them. This resulted in an uncanny landscape in Poland, with Catholic Poles living among the monumental ruins of their murdered neighbors. But do the ruins of a synagogue or a cemetery in a Polish village point to Jewish absence or Jewish presence? New research by young historian Hilik Weizmann from Hebrew University highlights the ways that while for returning Jews, these ruins symbolized the absence, indeed the end, of Jewish culture in Poland, for their Catholic Polish neighbors, these desecrated traces were a more disturbing presence. They were a permanent fixture in Polish towns that pointed directly to the violent disappearance of their Jewish neighbors. This is especially so because the Germans had often used cemeteries as sites of mass murder and burial of their victims. But these material traces also embodied the psychological unease associated with not only the murder, but also the subsequent expropriation of Jews by their Catholic neighbors. Thus, they were experienced as a physical accusation, to quote Weizmann, a mute witness, an accusing finger, a reminder and a threat that the remaining Poles might need to account for themselves. Both local people and the state used various strategies to contain, erase, or lash out at these sites in physical or discursive ways, polonizing them, talking about them in the past tense, othering or neglecting them, or denigrating them to legitimize their destruction. While many such sites were demolished or converted for other purposes, even attempts to obliterate them reaffirmed how compelling their presence was to their neighbors. The ambivalence associated with these sites, the sense of guilt, of ghosts, of unsureness about their ownership, kept them in a kind of limbo until internal and external political sentiments later shifted again and Jews once again could make claims on them. But just as these objects attracted hostility, they also formed placeholders for the memory of Jewishness and served as platforms for future recall. There are fascinating debates among scholars about the relationship between the presence of Jewish sites, spaces, things, and activities, new activities commemorating Jews, and the seeming absence of social memory of Jews and of the Holocaust among Poles. Sociologist Sławomir Kapralski suggests that the lack of pre-war identification with Jews as part of the Poles' own community, plus the lack of official post-war discourse about the Holocaust as a discrete historical event, means that while Holocaust memory in Poland may today be constructed by elites in commemorations and monuments and memorials, it cannot be retrieved in any meaningful way in the broader population. Cultural studies scholar Roma Sendeka has alternatively shown intriguing ways that a kind of ethical memory can persist outside of the discursive realm. In what she calls non-sites of memory, she uses ethnographic approaches to show how everyday trajectories and avoidances by local people can encode a silent memory of sacred or sacrilegious sites. National attempts at creating a new post-war social order, and even today a new Polish national imaginary, must thus contend with sometimes unsettling material forces, like a few yards of unmowed grass, where a farmer's wrist remembers from habit that there was a mass grave of Jews, and so year after year he leaves this one patch untilled. Anthropologist Jonathan Weber, too, describes how long ago demolished Jewish cemeteries still exist vibrantly in Polish villagers' minds, and they speak of them as if they speak of them as landmarks as if they were still visible. So, turn right at the Jewish cemetery, and when you look, there's nothing there. Presence and absence are thus cultural constructions. For this reason, we cannot take these materials at face value. Their physical realities gain their meanings in dialogue with social, cultural, and political frameworks, and also the narratives into which they are conscripted or from which they are excluded. Now, for the rest of my remarks, I would like to turn to my own recent research, which has also begun to deal with Jewish absence and presence in the material realm, but material of a different sort. There is a word for post-Jewish things in Polish, po-żydowskie. This category of material culture is often used to describe the ambivalent way that Catholic Poles inherited not only Jewish monumental heritage, but of course what had been Jewish houses, eating off of Jewish plates, even sleeping under Jewish comforters in the post-war era. But I've become interested in another different category of post-Jewish things. These are things made by non-Jewish Poles, but which in some way represent or register the memory of an imagination about Jews that testifies to these two communities' long co-presence. And I will give you 3 quick examples of such objects, awkwardly linked to Jewishness in Polish ethnographic collections and expressing both Jewish presence and Jewish absence. The first 2 objects are found in the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, a museum where the Polish nation envisioned by the curators is fundamentally a Slavic Catholic one. While Jews are not completely absent from the permanent exhibit, which not incidentally was opened in 1968, they are radically peripheral to the nation presented by the displays. Out of more than 40 thematic sections regarding Polish folk life, Jews appear here as subjects in only about 5 of them and are conspicuously absent in displays on, for example, folk music, paper cutting, and innkeeping, domains in which Jews were widespread and influential and remain present in popular memory. But Jews do appear in the museum, though elsewhere. Through the eyes of their ethnic Polish neighbors, as costumes and masks donned for caroling, as puppets in Christmas creches, as Judas effigies, as was just mentioned and I think will be again, to hang, beat, burn, and drown at Easter time, and as figurines, toy Jews who play music, read cryptic texts, and rock or bobble in a comic simulation of Hasidic prayer. And of course, more recently, they also hold gold coins. So this is the first of my three categories of awkward post-Jewish objects, objects that depict Jews as stereotypes. Deeply rooted in Polish, pagan, Catholic, peasant cosmology, they registered the Jews that long lived alongside these Polish villagers as marginal neighbors with their strange dress, different work habits, different religious observance, and a foreign language, and were experienced by their village neighbors as powerful in ambivalent, often magical ways. And I'm speaking now as a curator, so absent in the museum has been any kind of critical interpretive material for visitors to understand the deeply problematic nature of these objects. And this is especially, to me, an egregious oversight given how these forms have reemerged in religious ritual and also these highly politicized contexts in recent years. A second category of awkward object are shared Polish-Jewish objects, objects used by both Catholic and Jewish communities in Poland. Today, these objects are presented monoculturally. What was for me immediately recognizable, as you can see in this slide, as a Purim grogger, is presented in the museum as a terkotka used by Christians during Holy Week. This object's potential Jewishness is silenced here, a lost opportunity to tell a difficult story of cultural proximity and occasional violence, cultural exchange, and hybridity that could help both communities understand their culture in more expansive and mutually implicated ways. A third kind of object is the fascinating genre of post-war Polish folk art that depicts the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Holocaust. And I recently co-curated with my colleague Roma Sendyka and Magdalena Zich and Wojciech Wilczyk an exhibition of these works in Krakow, and I had to restrain myself to not talk only about them, but I've been talking about them so much. So these were made by Polish Catholic peasants, and they are tantalizing in that they seem to be a kind of folk Holocaust memorial at first glance. Yet their biographies, which involve both Polish communist museum ethnographers and German Christian pacifist collectors, makes understanding them in those terms much less straightforward. These objects are awkward for the difficult histories they point directly to, and because of this, they have languished in the archives of museums that are constitutionally unprepared to deal with things like politics and emotion, even leaving aside their potential political sensitivity today or in the past. I want to quickly argue, though, how folk art depicting Jews formed an intriguing site of non-discursive memory, or silent speech, during Poland's communist era. Poland's recently murdered Jewish community was politically, and for some, perhaps emotionally, unmentionable. Yet archival photos, such as this one, show that carver Tadeusz Tsonkawa's sculpture, Jewish Family, was given a prominent place in a May 1976 exhibit at Warsaw State Ethnographic Museum, where it was also selected as the cover image for the catalog. Further, it was one of 3 images selected to represent the show in a long review in the Zielony Sztandar, or the Green Banner, the Polish Peasant Party weekly. Artist, collector, curator, and journalist all chose to depict this taboo topic. Yet neither in the exhibit, the catalog, nor the review is a single word said about Jews, suggesting that the sculptures served as a form of wordless discourse at a time when explicit discussions were difficult. The waning of communism in Poland has led to an explosion of Jews and Jewishness in the country. This includes, at this point, almost 3 generations of Poles rediscovering their Jewish roots since the late 1970s, as well as a foreign Jewish tourist industry that has grown up in dialogue with these developments, creating new Jewish community centers, as well as unique categories of new Jews, Catholic Jews, Jewish Poles and Polish Jews, and Jewish-identified hangers-on of various stripes. And Stanisław Krajewski, who's here with us, has a wonderful typology in his, of such categories in his book, Reflections of a Polish Jew. These complicate questions of Jewish presence and absence in new ways, both in terms of communal and personal identities and the fate of once post-Jewish material heritage of all kinds. Non-Jewish Polish activists discovered Jewish sites like cemeteries and synagogues, already starting in the 1970s and still happening today, which sparked a new era of recalling the memory of ethno-national pluralism and a vibrant array of new forms of commemoration. And you can just see some examples of, there's just a wild number of festivals and art projects and cultural projects going on to engage with Jewish heritage. Scholars dealing with the relation of non-Jewish Poles to the memory of Poland's Jewish community are split. Some treat these engagements with a deep hermeneutics of suspicion, while others see a realm of great possibility. Returning to my recent research, and just to close, I can say that contemporary museum practice in Poland remains tangled up in the same silences and anxieties that surround these communist-era objects themselves. A 2016 exhibit at Zachęta, Poland's National Modern Art Gallery in Warsaw, titled Poland, Land of Folklore, ? Did a fine job of sketching out the centrality of folk art in Poland's communist-era heritage industry. But it strangely replicated that era's silence around Jews in the ethno-national construction of the Polish folk. The folk art room in the exhibit looped fragments of Andrzej Wajda's famous filmmaker, his film about German journalist and folk art collector Ludwig Simmerer's collection, even showing key Holocaust-related pieces in the film. Yet these flickered by quickly past on the screen with zero interpretive material for viewers to understand what they were seeing. It was as if even among many progressive Polish curators today, there is something unspeakable and therefore challenging to fully witness about Jewishness and the Holocaust when the Polish nation is on display. And I will just end where I began with this photo in my opening slide. I should explain that it's a picture of American klezmer dance teacher Steve Weintraub, who for many years has taught workshops at the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival, one of the most successful but also disputed events among critical observers. Steve interpolated himself here into a display that was part of an exhibit that I curated in 2013 at the Krakow Ethnographic Museum of Jewish folk art figurines. Steve wrote a blog post on his website wondering about whether his non-Jewish Polish dance students were starting to dehumanize him, to view him as a sort of stereotype. They asked him year after year to do the same dance from Fiddler on the Roof where he balances a bottle on his head. It had never bothered him before, but looking at these figurines, which populated not only the gallery walls, but of course still today can be found for sale in the small shops and restaurant right across the street from the museum, where they also function as talismans for good luck in business for their owners. I thought the image was a good one to linger on, a metaphor for the tense, complicated, and perhaps inverse relationship between actual Jews or Native Americans or African Americans, and the wide range of representations of, engagements with, and appropriations of these groups' cultures, which always exist, as this symposium's title suggests, in dialogue. Thank you.
So I'm back. I also wasn't initially intending to talk about this because it didn't happen, but on April 22nd, on Easter Monday in Poland, Bishop Rafał Markowski, the chair of the Council for Religious Dialogue within the Polish Episcopate and the chair of Committee for Dialogue with Judaism, was forced to react to the incidents mentioned in Pruchnik on Good Friday, the so-called Judgment of Judas. And this is the image from that incident. Ostensibly, it was a reenactment of Judgment of Judas on Good Friday, but it became very clear that there are contemporary connotations when the 30 lashes that the effigy got from the children were complemented by additional 5 lashes advocated by adults, quote, because they wanted the reparations from Poland, a reference to the bill, Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Today Act that passed last year. After the local newspaper reported about the Pruknik's Judas judgment and the story gained traction, it elicited condemnation from the World Jewish Congress, and then on Easter Monday, Bishop Markowski issued a statement. In the context of the events that took place in Pruknik on April 19th, the church clearly expresses her disapproval of practices that violate human dignity. The Catholic Church will never tolerate manifestations of contempt, pogarda in Polish, towards members of any nation, including the Jewish people. At this Easter season, we recall the truth of faith that Christ gave his life for the salvation of all, from which results Christian attitudes of respect toward every human being. Comments left by readers online demonstrate that both the events in Pruknik and the response of the Polish Bishops' Council elicited a strong backlash. But the Pruknik incident illustrates the dilemma the Catholic Church has faced when confronting anti-Semitism. The Church has been trapped between a need for moral response, condemning despicable acts, and public sentiments condoning these very acts. All this sometimes also encumbered by local politics. But the Church's complex responses to anti-Jewish prejudice also illustrate the existence of multiplicity of voices within the Church itself. The Church is constituted of many agents. It wants to present itself as the Church, but it has many agents with different views and attitudes present even among its leaders. These different voices, some righteous and prophetic, as Adam Michnik has put it, and some more pragmatic, have always competed with one another. They are still audible among the leaders of the Catholic Church, both in Poland and within the Church more broadly. Both the Church in Rome and the Church in Poland worked slowly to recognize and address the question of anti-Semitism. In 1938, Pope Pius XI informally expressed discomfort with anti-Semitism, calling it a movement incompatible, inadmissible, and alien in which Christians can have no part, while allowing the faithful, quote, all the right to defend themselves, to adopt measures of protection against what threatens their legitimate interest. And he distinguished between racial anti-Semitism, which was not compatible with theologically motivated hope for Jewish conversion, and what some called at the time the so-called Jewish question, anti-Jewish sentiments grounded ostensibly in economic, political, and social matters. A thin line, for sure, and one loaded with ambiguity. This cautious ambiguity is what marks the Catholic Church's responses to anti-Jewish sentiments and actions. In 1946, the Kielce pogrom, in which dozens of Jews were brutally murdered over the course of many hours, elicited passionate responses from Polish intellectuals, both secular and those identifying as religious, including former and self-described anti-Semites like Konstanty Ildefons Gałczyński and the influential pre-war politicians associated with Endecja like Stanisław Grabski. Grabski, for example, connected the protection of Jews with the protection of the good Polish name in the world. Such protection, he argued, would only be effective through healing of Polish life from hatred and the reign of our Christian morality in the whole of our lives, both in private and in public life, always and everywhere commanding love of neighbor. That voice calling for end of hatred and for renewed Christian morality was also heard from Bishop of Częstochowa, Theodor Kubina, who spoke with righteous clarity just days after the pogrom in Kielce, for after all, who could not agree that a brutal killing of dozens of innocent survivors, men, women, and infants, was not a horrendous crime? In Kielce, Bishop Kubina stated, yes, I do have that slide. In Kielce, mass slaughter was committed on Polish citizens of Jewish nationality. The moral and actual perpetrators of the slaughter have trampled on human dignity and horribly violated the Christian commandment of love for one's neighbor and universal principle, do not kill. Nothing, absolutely nothing justifies the Kielce crime, which is deserving of the wrath of God. The bishop then condemned fanaticism of those who used to criminal ends medieval ideas and beliefs that are alien both to the Christian community and to the principles of the general coexistence of all fellow citizens, without distinction of nationality and religion. Those people, he said, must be absolutely and without objections condemned as criminals according to all divine and human laws. Those who have been provoked into crimes confounded our internal coexistence in the country and defamed the good name of a Pole abroad. Indeed, he added, the Kielce crime was unquestionably condemned by all those who have, by all those who have heartbeat of neighborly love. He then appealed to human consciousness and a Christian and moral principles and condemned both the violence and the ritual murder libel, which started the pogrom and which he called lies. This was by far the boldest statement condemning both the Kielce pogrom and, for the first time in centuries, the blood libel. And Kubina's statement was apparently also read in other dioceses. Still, the Bishop of Kielce and the Polish episcopate were more circumspect. On July 11th, 1946, 4 days after Bishop Kubina's letter, Cardinal Augustyn Chlond, the Primate of Poland, at a press conference issued a statement condemning all murders, regardless if they targeted Poles or Jews in Kielce and in all parts of Poland. But he also added, during the extermination under the German occupation, Poles, though they themselves were targeted, supported, hid, and rescued Jews, putting their own lives in danger. Many Jews in Poland owe their lives to Poles and Polish clergy, the primate continued. Jews holding leading state positions and seeking to establish a regime the vast majority of the nation does not want in Poland can be held responsible that this great relationship is being destroyed. It is a destructive game, he added, because it leads to dangerous tensions. In fatal armed clashes on a political battlefield, unfortunately, some Jews perish, but so do immeasurably more Poles. The sentiment in Cardinal Chlond's statement showed the trap of what became anti-communist obsession that will become a major, as I mentioned earlier, obstacle to Polish-Jewish relations and later efforts of reconciliation. In 1946, the Catholic Church in Poland was in a difficult point. It was facing a hostile regime, as the primate noted, rejected by many, and one still fought in armed clashes. In fact, Bishop Czesław Kaczmarek of Kielce would be arrested in 1950 and then imprisoned and tried by communists and sentenced to 12 years in prison, which he didn't serve because of the changes that happened after 1956. But it was still a regime that in a complicated way, for better or for worse, also came out against anti-Semitic attacks, and was now seen as pro-Jewish, run by Jews, as we've seen. In this struggle, anti-Semitism became both a liability and a weapon. And so what could have been a clear condemnation of undeniably horrific violence and murder became politicized. The Bishop of Kielce, who saw firsthand what some Kielce citizens were capable of doing, may have been fearful of losing local support. He thus echoed Cardinal Hlon's sentiments, and Cardinal Hlon, for his part, sought to protect the interest of the church. Losing faithful over a response to violence against Jews would have been precarious. But as Bishop Kubina's response shows, one could focus on just this one issue, an issue that could have been addressed with moral clarity without needing to become or appear philo-Semitic. The tendency, however, became to dilute any statement concerning Jews with other issues, such as the opposition to communism. This tension was not unique to the church in Poland. As World War II demonstrated the human capability for utmost brutality and ruthlessness, exposing the depths of hatred, many Christian thinkers began to probe to what extent Christian theological teachings may have contributed to that ruthless anti-Semitism. These early conversations were not easy, and it took 20 years from the end of World War II until the Vatican II Declaration Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate was initially intended to be a decree on the Jews, but it ended up being diluted to a declaration about non-Christian religions, and with the discussion of Jews included in the last fourth paragraph. Nostra Aetate, when you read it closely, in the end says nothing about Jews. It only addressed theological teachings of deicide and the idea that God had rejected Jews. But for all its weaknesses, it has led to tremendous transformations in the Catholic-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation. And it too embodies the polyphonic aspect of the church, including voices of those who genuinely sought to reconsider the church's teachings and actions and inactions, and are unafraid to look honestly in the mirror, and those who were protective of the church and unwilling to reckon with the past and tradition and seek to shield behind other topics and aspects of history. It took a long time to begin to implement Nostra Aetate. How long? It depended on a country. The French bishops, for instance, issued a statement on relations with Jews 5 years after Nostra Aetate. There's in 1972. I'm sorry, 7 years. I made the wrong thing, 7 years. Their statement was also a theological affirmation of the Vatican Declaration and said little about the more recent painful past. It was only in September 1997, in the midst of the Maurice Papon trial that was itself part of French reckoning with the Vichy past, when the Catholic bishops of France addressed World War II. But when they did, they issued a movingly sincere document. The French bishops' document was framed around questions of conscience, which no human can ignore. It noted the Catholic Church knows full well that conscience is formed in remembering, and that just as no individual can live with himself, neither can society live in peace with a repressed or untruthful memory. Reckoning with choosing pragmatism over decisive moral stances, the bishops noted that when French Jews were in internment camps and the country, quote, had been beaten, lay prostrate, and was partially occupied, The hierarchy saw the protection of its own faithful as its first priority, assuring as much as possible its own institutions. This priority was legitimate, the bishop stated, but it was also a retreat to a narrow, and I quote, a narrow vision of the church's mission at a time when many members of the church and many non-Catholics yearned for the church to speak out at a time of such spiritual confusion and to recall the message of Jesus Christ. Thus, those in authority of the church caught up in loyalism and docility remained stuck in conformity, prudence, and abstention. The church leaders in France, the bishop's statement said, failed to realize that the church, called at the moment to play a role of defender within a social body that was falling apart, did in fact have considerable power and influence, and that in the face of silence of other institutions, its voice could have echoed loudly by taking a definite stand against the irreparable. The letter is long and rich in content and contained a powerful passage which I think could serve as a model for any reconciliation, including Polish-Jewish. This is sorry. Okay, here it is. We can pass no judgment, the French bishops wrote, either on the conscience of the people of that era. We are not ourselves guilty of what took place in the past, but we must be fully aware of the cost of such behavior and actions. It is our church, and we are obliged to acknowledge objectively today that ecclesiastical interests understood in an overly restrictive sense took priority over demands of conscience, and we must ask ourselves why. In Poland, the impact of Nostra Aetate and later efforts of reconciliation between Polish Jews and Catholics and between Poles and Jews was hampered by communist and anti-communist politics. Its implementation in Poland, that is of Nostra Aetate, was made impossible after 1968 and the silence that followed. But the existence of the declaration was known, and some years later, Pope John Paul II provided leadership through public gestures and substantive statements to those who wanted change for the better. But Nostra Aetate, paradoxically, also provided a shield. It focused only on theological matters, the relation of Jews with God, without touching directly on the immediate past. One could conceivably engage in the theological dialogue with Jews without having to face the painful past. Positive change is difficult and slow, despite the most sincere efforts. It is clear from the history of Nostra Aetate and Catholic-Jewish dialogue in Poland. Among the leaders of the Catholic Church in Poland, the two voices we heard in the aftermath of the Kielce pogrom continue to sound. On the one hand, there are those genuinely interested in honest reckoning with the past, and on the other hand, there are those who continue to hide behind these protective shields of Nazism, communism, anti-communism, and even theology. These voices, almost a duophonic back and forth chorus, are heard distinctly in most of the documents issued by the Catholic Church in Poland. While the bishops of France and Bishop Kubina stayed focused on the morality of the atrocities Jews suffered and considered what role Christian compatriots may have played, the Polish bishops tended to vacillate between sincere reckoning with the past and hiding behind those protective shields. In 1991, the pastoral letter issued by the Polish bishops, a voice resembling that of Bishop Kubina, regretted that some Catholics remained indifferent to the incomprehensive tragedy of the mass murder of Jews on the Polish soil. or worse, that some Catholics were the cause of the death of Jews. They will forever gnaw on our conscience. They wrote, if only one Christian could have helped and did not stretch out a helping hand to a Jew during the time of danger or caused his death, we must ask for forgiveness to our Jewish brothers and sisters. This unquestionably sincere voice was then immediately countered by a voice that resembled the sentiments already expressed by by Cardinal Chlon and Bishop Kaczmarek. We are aware, the second voice interjected, that many of our compatriots still remember the injustices and injuries committed by the post-war communist authorities, in which people of Jewish origin also took part. We must acknowledge, however, that the source of the inspiration of their activity was clearly neither their origin nor religion, but the communist ideology from which the Jews themselves, in fact, suffered many injustices. The first voice then took its turn expressing regrets for all the incidents of anti-Semitism committed at any time and by anyone on Polish soil. But then the second voice returned, drawing attention to the untrue and deeply harmful concept of Polish anti-Semitism, and reminded the audience that the Poles as a nation were one of the first victims of the same criminal racist ideology of Hitler's Nazism. This back and forth weakened the impact of those most powerful passages that would have helped Polish Catholics to move forward toward a better understanding of the past and toward a meaningful dialogue on Polish-Jewish relations. These divergent voices were still heard, though to a lesser extent, within the Polish Catholic Church in the statement on the Jubilee of 2000, which powerfully calls for the purification of memory and reconciliation. It calls for the memory of the Holocaust to be preserved, and in the spirit of the Jubilee's act of penance, notes that along noble efforts by Poles to rescue many Jewish lives, there are also our sins from that period, indifference or enmity towards Jews. The letter calls to overcome all expressions of anti-Jewishness, anti-Jewish Judaism, and anti-Semitism that existed and exist among Christians. These powerful words are then somewhat muted by a short statement demanding that anti-Polonism should be fought with equal determination. The issue of anti-Polonism returns in many statements by Polish bishops, even those that sincerely seek Polish-Jewish reconciliation and dialogue. It is true, anti-Polonism exists among Jews. But one also has to be mindful that anti-Polonism is also an anti-Semitic trope developed at the end of World War I among Polish nationalists. It reframed the old trope of Jews as enemies of Christianity in a new national mold, presenting Jews as enemies of Poland. In fact, as I've learned from my student Agata Sobczak, that Jews the Polish nationalist press noted that Jews sought to, quote, slander Poland and turn the opinion of the whole world against Poland was already deployed as an anti-Semitic argument against Jews in Polish nationalist press in 1918. To be sure, Jewish-Catholic relations have improved since World War II and since 1965. But in Poland, the delayed implementation of Nostra Aetate, the conflicted voices, and above all, the inability to confront the past in a focused and straightforward way have resulted in mixed messages and the occasional flare-ups like this year we've seen over Easter. The 1997 letter of the Polish bishops, of the French bishops, might offer a way forward, a way to address with sincerity and without distractions the core moral issues of the past, for as Abraham Lincoln said, we cannot escape history. But the way we understand history shapes the way we forge our future. Thank you.
I wish to thank Jonathan Brandt for inviting me to this conference. And two preliminary remarks. Okay, sorry. Yeah. I will be speaking to you about a shared past, a history that divides, to quote Elżbieta Janicka, who was also invited to this conference, but was unfortunately unable to attend. This means that I will be speaking from the perspective of a Holocaust historian from Germany who has been living in Warsaw for almost 10 years and who recognizes the radical split in perspective and experience between perpetrators, victims, and participating observers, to use a term introduced by Elżbieta Janicka, to conceptualize the non-Jewish majority population in Poland. Second remark, I will be speaking about Nachman Blumental as a survivor, historian, and scholar. And I'm here as a member of a research group headed by Judith Leoncon from Paris and Aurelia Kaliski from Berlin. And as a member of this group, I made 2 excursions to Vancouver last year to visit Miran Blumental, whom you have seen this morning, to unearth and undig from his crawl space 20.
Oh, you have this mic on. That's
Okay.
why there's a feedback.
To undig and unearth from his crawl space in Surrey
Maybe you can turn this off and we can speak to this one.
Okay. Okay, sorry. From the crawl space, 20 boxes with Holocaust-related material amounting to 32 bankers' boxes that I helped ship to YIVO. And they are now in possession of YIVO. And I wish to thank Professor Richard Menkes from UBC in Vancouver, Professor Sima Godfrey, Peter Wall Institute, Michelle Smolkin, Anja Switzer, and my colleagues from Berlin and Paris, Malina Chinsky. My paper is divided into 3 parts. During World War II, the German occupiers murdered more than 90% of the Jewish population in Poland. The majority were killed in Nazi extermination camps in an extremely short period of time. However, the Shoah cannot be reduced to a confrontation between Nazis and Jews. It is also, to quote Jan Tomasz Gross and Irena Grudzińska-Gross, quote, a confrontation between institutions and civilian populations of occupied Europe and the Jews who had lived in these countries for generations, end of quote. Parts of the non-Jewish majority population in Poland actively and passively participated in the persecution and murder of Polish Jews, Polish citizens. Part 2 of my paper will demonstrate, as Elżbieta Janicka emphasizes, that, quote, the German Nazi state system of extermination and the local context were linked in a way that mutually multiplied their effectiveness, end of quote. The Germans were not omnipresent, in particular not in the countryside, the topic which is the subject of part 2 of my paper. Polish Jews were mostly surrounded by their non-Jewish neighbors. Before elaborating on that situation of spatial proximity, let me say a few words on Nachman Blumental's return to Łódź in 1944. After the Red Army had liberated the eastern parts of Poland from German occupation in the summer of 1944, Polish Jewish survivors were determined to establish the facts concerning the destruction of European Jewry, to document the crimes and to assist in bringing the perpetrators and their helpers to justice. By gathering, editing, and publishing source material, and for this purpose they founded new Jewish institutions. The Central Jewish Historical Commission in Lublin in 1944, and in 1947 its successor, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. These institutions were founded not by the Polish state, but they received their money from Jewish institutions. As an academic employee of the Central Commission and first director of the Jewish Historical Institute, Nachman Blumental journeyed to towns and cities all over Poland in order to collect evidence, survivor testimony, and sources concerning ghettos and camps, among them songs and poems. Here, for example, you can see poems in Polish written by a 16-year-old girl, Halina Liebeskind, written in Auschwitz in 1943. They were part of the boxes and the crawl space in Vancouver. Walking around the post-ghetto space in the city of Łódź, where he had worked as a teacher before World War II, Blumental retrieved and preserved Holocaust sources pertaining to events, places, and people, physical objects as well as pictorial and verbal items. He later recalled, quote, "Łódź looked even sadder than other places because no trace of extermination was to be seen here at all. The city had remained almost untouched by the acts of war. Even that part where the Jews had once lived, later the ghetto, had not changed. The same streets, the same houses, only one thing was missing: life. No people, an extinct city," end of quote. Survivor historians were immediately confronted with the absence of the Jews as well as with the continuity and omnipresence of anti-Semitic violence after liberation. Just to say that Jews continued to experience anti-Semitic violence on a daily basis. Blumental, who had a special interest in Yiddish literature and was educated at Warsaw University, had fled Łódź in September 1939 for the Soviet Union, where he escaped the Holocaust. He kept a diary which is now part of the collection at YIVO. Blumental was a multilingual philologist tied to both Polish and Jewish culture. He was especially interested in the power of language in the destruction process. He investigated the German Nazi Tarnsprache and deciphered the real meaning of the camouflaged words and terms meant to confuse the victims. He compiled a dictionary of German Nazi terms, part one of which was published in 1947 by the Jewish Historical Commission under the title Słowa niewinne, which means, innocent words. For this purpose, he collected and analyzed a lot of original German documents, which he found in Łódź in the buildings, for example, used by the Gestapo. Here you can see an anti-Semitic leaflet sung by German Kripo policemen. Blumental, as we have heard from Gabriel Fender, was an expert witness in the trial of Rudolf Höss, and he participated in other trials of Nazi perpetrators in post-war Poland. Here is a slide of a picture taken at the Bibo trial in 1947. He also made an effort, we heard that also before, to establish the exact number of victims murdered in an administrative and industrial way in the Nazi extermination camps. And for this purpose, he traveled to places, for example, to Chełmno. This could have been a scene from Lanzmann's Shoah for anybody who saw the film, but this is immediate post-war period with Blumental in the middle, and the gaze that I'm talking about now of the participating observers. Part 2, the real, discerning the murder of Ariel and Maria Blumental in its traces. In the Blumental archive, there's a trace of the murder of his wife Maria Blumental née Tevel and their 3-year-old son Ariel. In June 43 in Wielopole Skrzynski in near Maria's hometown in Dębica. So here you have Dębica, Wielopole, Brzeżina. So these 3 places will play a role. So in the southern part of Poland. You might have heard the name Wielopole before in connection with Tadeusz Kantor, a famous Polish theater director and playwright who was actually born in Wielopole, and a few years ago they put up this monument for the young Kantor and his sister, but it's called Tadeusz Kantor Monument. Pomnik Tadeusza Kantora, no? So this is the pomnik, the monument to Tadeusz Kantor on the market square in Wielopole. In the summer of 1948, Blumental traveled to Wielopole and its surroundings to investigate the circumstances of the murder of his wife and son. He spoke to those who had been present in Wielopole in June 43 and wrote down what they said. I discovered the Polish handwritten report, which is also on display outside, the original that I discovered in one of the 20 boxes. So I discovered, thanks to my friend and colleague Elżbieta Janicka, we have a first transcription of this document. And you can see how Blumental recycled German documents because it's written on a piece of paper from the German occupation period. It is a trace pertaining to a crime during the last phase of the Holocaust in Poland, i.e. after the Germans had liquidated almost all of the ghettos and murdered most Jews in extermination camps or on the spot. Blumental's report displays general mechanisms characteristic of what the Germans termed Judenjagd, i.e., Judenjagd, so hunt for Jews. Firstly, the active participation of the so-called blue police in the process. They depended on non-Jewish Polish neighbors who helped them by denouncing Jews. By this means, the police was able to capture the victims. Afterwards, they either handed them over to the Germans, in Blumental's case, an Austrian Nazi officer called Windisch, or they shot them themselves. Secondly, the trace discloses the activities and attitudes of the dominant majority as participating observers, who created a performative efficiency. So I'm going to talk about now about this activity of these observers who observed the shooting in Wielopole in the Jewish cemetery in June 43. The murder of Maria and Ariel Blumental was not an isolated case in Wielopole's history during the Holocaust. If anything, it was a typical case. On June 30th, 42, at least 60 Jews of Wielopole were shot to death in the Jewish cemetery. We know that because there are other traces, for example, a painting. And in Blumental's report, there's a trace of another Jewish woman called Bergerova, who was also shot to death together with her 8-year-old son. We are dealing here with an open and public crime implicating those present in the village, something that Patrick Desbois, who is going to speak, I believe, tomorrow here, calls in broad daylight, yes? So visible for everybody. In what follows, I will provide a detailed description of this murder, trying to reconstruct and deconstruct the observer's narrative. A key sentence in this trace is the phrase "Wszyscy patrzyli." Everybody was watching. The villagers were watching, quote, when the German policeman and the blue policeman led my wife and the child from the police station through the town along the river, end of quote. The participating subjects perceived the event during the phantasmatic frame of Christian martyrdom, quote, she stopped 3 times on her way. She rested. She talked about something with the Germans, end of quote. The implication in the genocidal situation activated a series of defense mechanisms on the part of the observers, such as the self-perception of being completely helpless or the manifestation of pity. There's this phrase, the whole village was crying. The observers placed the blame on the side of the victims instead of on the perpetrators or on themselves. Quote, if it had not been for the child, my wife would have lived. End of quote. These words again testify to a phantasmatic perception of reality through the frame of anti-Semitism. So the guilt is on the side of the Jews, according to this perception. The report testifies to the close proximity of the observing subjects to the site of the execution in the Jewish cemetery, located on a hill and well visible from the little town next to the hill. Franciszek Łuszczak, who lived beside the cemetery, showed Blumental the place where Maria and Ariel had been shot. Łuszczak, quote, saw everything. He recalled that they had first shot Maria, then her son. The they remains unspecified. Neither the perpetrators nor the helpers are mentioned by Łuszczak. He told Blumental that the graves had already been prepared, but he did not say who had prepared them. So this is always in this report, we don't know exactly who did what, who spoke, who narrates. Sometimes we know who narrates, sometimes we don't. In this case, we don't. For Blumental, the pain and the suffering of his wife and son were most important. Quote, my wife was calming down the child. Calm down. Maria defended herself and Ariel by refusing to undress. The perpetrators resorted to physical violence. They ripped Maria's clothes off and shot her naked. Blumental, quote, they shot her with 1 bullet. She asked to be shot first. She did not want to look at the death of her son. She did not want to undress. The child started to cry, Mom, Mom, where's Mommy? He shot at the child. He shot once and injured him. He shot a second time and killed him. The child was screaming. My wife was buried without clothes, my child with clothes on, end of quote. Both the they and the he remain unspecified. Everybody present forced Maria and Ariel Blumental into a situation with no way out. It was murder carried out in a cruel way. They were trapped. There was no escape because the blue policemen and the participating observers used their agency in such a way as to drive the process forward that led to the murder of Ariel and Maria. The blue policemen had caught them, brought them to the police station in the morning where they were on display for hours for the observers. They stalked their prey, observing every move. The observers and the policemen were waiting together for the Germans. Upon their arrival, they had freedom of maneuver. They could have done something to let them go, or done nothing, i.e. not to have called the Germans. Instead, they adopted the role of the last instance, druga instancia, again a term introduced by Elżbieta Janicka, perceiving this situation in such a way as if there had been no alternative but to call the Germans. Janicka, quote, the scenario with no alternative produces reality with no alternative, end of quote. The Austrian Windisch adopted the role expected of him, namely to carry out the shooting. He did not say no. Instead, he shifted the responsibility exclusively onto the participating observers and the blue policemen. For Blumental, the experience, the pain, and fear of his wife and child facing death were of central importance. Maria, who tried to pass as a Catholic Pole, was fighting for her life until the very end. Quote, "My wife claimed that she was Polish. She asked for a priest. They did not let him come. She carried my child in her arms." End of quote. One villager named Zaletnik claims not to remember anything, but, quote, "knows that nobody wanted to shoot at my wife and child. One of the Polish policemen was given my wife's coat, and he also did not want to shoot. Even the German officer Windisch from Vienna did not want to shoot." End of quote. So you can see nobody wanted to do it, but somehow everybody did it, no? According to Zaletnik, it was Windisch who shot a few times, first my wife, then my child. End of quote. Blumental, who was in a state of shock, did not ask him who else was present at the Jewish cemetery. I want to suggest that for Blumental, the event of which he left a trace is to be understood as the real, after Lacan and Zizek, as, quote, "something which can neither be directly experienced nor symbolized, like a traumatic encounter of extreme violence which destabilized our entire universe of meaning," end of quote. According to Zizek, the real can only be discerned in its traces, effects, and aftershocks. So I'm going to talk now about the involvement of the blue policeman and Nachman Blumental's agency and the agency of survivor and what it meant to be a survivor historian with this kind of agency. Maria Blumental was seeking refuge in a territory familiar to her and in places that were close to her hometown. She was born in Dębica, and these places were Brzeżyny and Mała. Nachman Blumental's report began as follows, quote, "Brzeżyny, approximately 15 kilometers from," and then it's unreadable or illegible, "first farm coming from Dębica, Staszowska Kazia. She was the liaison between Maria and the Bavowa family. She says that at the beginning, Maria and Ariel spent about 2 months in Brzeżyny at Wodzież. Afterwards, they returned to Dębica. X, so unreadable, fetched Maria on foot. She was then unreadable for a few weeks, and later she fetched Maria with the child, and they were at her brother-in-law, a few kilometers from Brzeżyny. They were there for a few days. The blue Polish policemen carried out a search. They encountered Maria with the child at a small forest. Maria showed her identification papers, and the policeman, unreadable, turned around and checked if Ariel was a Jew. The policeman Akapeluch, he is now in prison in Tarnów, and Yaki, he ran away," end of quote. Carried out a search, encountered, the monstrosity of the crime is hidden, absent. The banal words used by the participating observers, as noted down by Blumental, belong to a world of experience that normalizes the persecution of Jews and excludes from the narrative certain important elements. Firstly, the fact that denunciation on the part of the villagers must have preceded the action of the blue policeman, that somebody must have brought them to this small forest. Secondly, that the capture of Maria and Ariel Blumental was neither mere coincidence, not a chance encounter, but the result of concrete acts of anti-Semitic violence. The participating observers dissociate themselves and the perpetrators from any personal responsibility. In their narration of the events, the victims' experience of enmity, fear, and despair is completely absent. And this is what I mean by split in experience. And because of this split in experience, terms like reconciliation make no sense to me. Jaki and Kapelusz actively participated, as I have established, analyzing the post-war trial proceedings in the German Nazi project of the final solution, i.e. the murder of all Jewish men, women, and children in the German sphere of influence. The policeman Wilhelm Jaki, who served as the German gendarme at the post in Dębica from January 43 to July 44, also headed the Polish police station in Wielopole. And Thomas Friedl has written about this county in the new book, Dalej jest noc. Some of you might have heard of this book. Jaki was deployed in the territory of Brzezinę, Nawsi, and Mauer. He participated in what the Germans called Judenjagd. He did not only capture Jewish men, women, and children, but also shot Jews, personally and out of his own initiative. Jaki made the farmer of Włodzież, who is mentioned in this trace, his informer. This was a common social practice. In rural areas, informers who had delivered Jews to the police were usually rewarded with goods that had belonged to the victims. In 1950, in a post-war interrogation, the accused Jaki testified that he once had given Włodzież the trousers of murdered Jews. Józef Kapelusz was also a member of the Blue Police in Wielopole. Jaki and Kapelusz would patrol the area as a team. Upon denunciations, they would inspect households and search houses of people whom their neighbors suspected of sheltering Jews. The key sentence, another key sentence in Blumental's report is Sprawdzili, czy Ariel był Żydem. They checked if Ariel was a Jew. By tracking Maria and Ariel down as if they were criminals, by identifying and defining them as Jews, the policemen committed acts of anti-Semitic violence. Examining Ariel to see if he was circumcised and acting upon their finding, they sentenced Maria and Ariel to death. Now I'm going to talk about Blumental's agency. On August 9, 1948, Blumental wrote an official letter to the state prosecutor at the district court in Tarnów, a copy of which I found in the 20 boxes in the Blumental collection. The original, which was written on the headed notepaper of the Jewish Historical Institute, is part of the files of the criminal proceedings against Kapelusz, which are now in the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland. Blumental wrote, okay. Yeah. Everybody was talking too long. Quote, having recently been in the area of Dębica, Wielopole, I learned from the local farmers about the fact that the former blue policeman Kapelusz is in the prison in Tarnów. I'm hastening to notify you that the policeman, together with his comrade Jaki, stopped my wife, Dr. Maria Blumental, together with her 2-year-old son, in the village of Mauer in June 1943, and afterwards delivered them to Wielopole, where they were shot the next day. At the same time, I'm asking you, Mr. State Prosecutor, to check with the accused if he could give the exact day it happened. If you, Mr. State Prosecutor, considered it admissible, I could meet with the accused and could be ready to present myself in Tarnów at the time specified by yourself. End of quote. Kapelusz was arrested for the first time in 1947 in a matter unrelated to the murder in Wielopole and released. Thanks to Blumental's letter, the state prosecutor initiated preliminary proceedings against Kapelusz on the legal basis of Article 1 of the decree of August 31, 1944 against people accused of collaboration with the enemy. The Milicja Obywatelska report established that Blumental and her son had been shot by a German in 1943 and that several policemen from the Polish police in Wielopole, among them Jaki and Kapelusz, had participated in the capturing. Consequently, Kapelusz was arrested for a second time. The state prosecutor in Dębica sent a letter to the Jewish Historical Institute requesting that Blumental be present in Dębica on May 22nd, 41. However, by this time, Blumental had already immigrated to Israel. On July 7, 41, the prosecutor proposed to drop the criminal proceedings concerning the murder of Mara and Ariel. Official justification, quote, the suspect Kapellusz denied that he had participated in the capturing of Mara and Ariel Blumental, while the witnesses testified that they could not assert that Kapellusz had taken part in the murder, end of quote. Two witnesses who had mentioned Kapellusz's name during the interrogations, during the subsequent interrogations by the prosecutor, claimed that they could not remember if it was Kapellusz or rather another policeman who was present at the crime scene. So, unfortunately, I have no time to go into these testimonies, but again, it's a rich source if you want to deconstruct the narrative of the participating observers. A short epilogue entitled Exhumation and Emigration from Poland. The registry office in Wielopolskie confirmed the death of Mara and Ariel Blumental on June 7, 43. Nachman Blumental requested an exhumation. Permission was granted on August 22, 48. The villagers of Wielopole had tried to persuade him to leave the remains of his wife and son in the Jewish cemetery in Wielopole. In an act of philo-Semitic violence, they posthumously included Maria Blumental in their community from which they had previously excluded her. Quote, Fela, so a Polish woman from the village, interprets the sympathy of people as stemming from the fact that they consider her Polish, and this is why I should not put anything Yiddish on this tombstone. Everyone from Wielopole and Fela too were of the opinion that I should not exhume them, but leave the bodies in Wielopole. Here she died, here they know her, here she could stay, said one person. She died because of my child. My wife claimed that the child's grandmother ordered the circumcision of the child with whom the child was brought up without her wife's knowledge. End of quote. We can discern a double frame here. It is the phantasmatic perception of reality on the part of the villagers through the frame of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism at the same time. They repeat, and this is the uncanny thing, if you have ever seen Lanzmann's Shoah or been at the conference in Paris in February, you know what I'm talking about. They repeat the victimization of Jews in Blumental's presence. So it's still going on. What condemned the Jews in their view was both their sheer existence, quote, she died because of my child, and what they did, quote, the grandmother ordered the circumcision of the child. In the beginning, Blumental thought of leaving the bodies in Wielopole. He figured that Maria's and Ariel's grave would not be defiled. Later, however, he thought that it was, quote, too difficult to get to Wielopole and that they would be on their own. Oni sami zostaną. Oni sami zostaną. He wanted to arrange a funeral for them that would be more impressive, okazało. He wished for genuine mourners to attend and to provide a public space for mourning with the remnants of the Jewish community in Warsaw. He considered the exhumation a necessity. For one main reason, to leave my wife in Wielopole would mean to agree that she was not Jewish. That was a quote. Thereby, Blumental challenges the force of the anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic interpretation. The funeral at the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw on Okupowa Street took place on September 2nd, 48. You have the necrologue here, the obituary, published by the Central Jewish Committee in Warsaw, and it says, quote, murdered by German thugs. No mention is made of the involvement of the blue policeman in the murder. And I said it before, Jews in Poland continue to experience everyday anti-Semitism. This might have been considerations for personal safety might have been the decisive factor for not mentioning the blue police. Also maybe Blumental at that time was still thinking of staying in Poland, we don't know, but this is what we have here. So, I have a psychoanalytic interpretation when it comes to the not mentioning of this. In Freud, there are several things. Yes, Verdrängung, Verwerfung, Verneinung, Verleugnung. I think we're dealing here with a case of Verwerfung. Verwerfen means literally to throw away in such a way as to not consider something anymore. Zizek writes with reference to Lacan that in Verwerfung the content is thrown out of the symbolic, desymbolized so that it can only return in the real, qua impossible. Blumental was aware of the fact that the conceptualization of the Holocaust as a sole confrontation between Nazis and Jews did not capture the reality of the event. However, he verwarf this difficult and devastating knowledge. He put it aside, as it were, or in a box, as it were, hidden from everybody, including himself and his son. And I'm finishing. There's another factor that seems to have contributed to Verwerfung as a coping mechanism. In view of the enormity of the Nazi crimes and the discovery of the mass murder of Jews carried out in the Nazi camps in Treblinka, Belgrade, Sobibor, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Kulmov, and other places, the German guilt and the responsibility of the German Nazi state for the destruction of European Jewry was overriding. Nothing like extermination camps had ever been created before. Survivor historians like Blumental were concerned with the question of how what the Germans called Endlösung became thinkable and possible, and how the Jewish community responded to it. If he had ever thought of staying in Poland after the Kielce pogrom and its consequences, the knowledge that Polish neighbors were involved in the murder of his wife and son must have changed the perception of the reality of so-called Polish-Jewish relations, a notion that I think hides a multitude of delusions and is rather an academic term that has nothing to do with reality. Nachman Blumental, deprived of his family and his Jewish community, did not see a future for himself in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these fantastic papers. We are well beyond schedule. We are supposed to finish at 4, so I suggest to have a 10-minute discussion and then have a 10-minute break and then move on with the last panel.
Collect questions.
I will, yeah, okay. So I will take few questions all together and then I will ask for the round.
Hi, thank you very much for that wonderful, harrowing and upsetting talk. At the very beginning of this presentation, you showed a photograph of Blumenthal and Chelmno, but there was no other mention of Chelmno throughout the presentation. I'm aware that at the very beginning of the war, there was a march in Chelmno where observers watched people, Jews being brought out. Was Blumenthal aware, was he involved in Chelmno in any other way in terms of publicizing information or any other connection with Chelmno?
Okay, and in the back, here, gentleman with a sweater with the stripes here. Okay.
Yes, I have a question about this first talk about Żydokomuna. So I'm just curious, for instance, what is the attitude in Poland to Spanish Civil War? There was a famous Polish battalion, Dąbrowski Battalion International Brigades, okay? And the commander of one of the most famous commanders was General Walter, who happened to be Karl Swerchewski. And I recently learned that he was Jewish. He was not. Huh? Huh?
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes,
If it's
but
that
anyways,
question-
what is the attitude? But half of the battalion, most of the people in the battalion were Jews and communists. What is the attitude to them?
Okay. A gentleman in the back in the red outfit.
I have a question for Professor Teter. When you dealt with the pastoral letters of the Polish bishops, you referred quite often to what was sincere. I was curious about how you determined what was sincere in those pastoral letters. Was it what you, was it based simply on the text? Did you have information independent of the text? And regardless of whether it was sincere or not, what were other possible motivations for those passages, whether theological or political?
Okay, and the last question, the lady in the front. Can we move the mic to the, yeah. I'm very sorry for not taking other questions.
We can discuss things in the break.
I'm curious about the Easter sermon that was just delivered by the bishop in Poland, and whether he was admonished by the church hierarchy.
All right, thank you so much. I think you have to turn on your mics or turn mics in your hands. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your question. That was part of his work, his job as a member of the Jewish Historical Commission, to go to the places and inspect the sites of crimes of mass murder. And Blumental edited a book called Obozy, Camps, on the concentration camp and extermination camps. And Helmno figures in this volume of documents. But I haven't found anything. For example, you can see him on this picture taking notes, as he would have done in Wielopole, surrounded by the villagers. I haven't found his handwritten notes on the Helmno situation, but that would be something to maybe look for in the boxes.
Can you hear me? Yes. I have a very short and clear reply to you. The majority of the people who were in the Polish brigade were Jewish. The majority of them, I think, not everybody, and they are not considered part. They are not celebrated in the official life, kind of, official history. But there is a group of young people in Warsaw who are very devoted to their tradition, and they try Dąbrowszczacy, and they try to somehow celebrate it, and they do celebrate it every year, and in a kind of very interesting way. So there is this little, I cannot even say that it's a splinter group. It's less than a splinter, but they exist, yes.
Okay, there are here in the audience and among participants some people who were actually part of those conversations of the Commission for the Dialogue with Jews, but I think at some level both voices that I was noting and that are sincere, that just come from very different places, and there are also those voices that I think do come from this place of needing to address some of those moral issues, the sort of pastoral issues in that way. So that's where I was reading it through the text. I do know some bishops in Poland, and I'm sort of aware of some of them in my own work on the Catholic Church. I'm aware of some of these different dynamics. But again, even on the broader scale of not just Poland, you have those different voices that are coming in from responding to some of to the history, to atrocities after World War II, needing to find that moral voice. So I think there is sincerity in that as well. There may have been part of if you are cynical, you could look at it that the voice of John Paul II provided leadership, and some of the members of the hierarchy wanted to speak with that voice. But I do want to believe that there are some sincere voices of wanting to speak with that moral clarity. I am aware of the bishop's comments at Easter. I'm not aware of any official. Maybe somebody who came from Poland and more local news would know whether there was any response to it. I know that the statement was issued about the Pruchnik, but I haven't heard about it. But again, at some level, when I saw the news, it was exactly the point that I was making, that there are these two different many different voices, some of those that are really following the Vatican II teachings and efforts to understand and reconcile, again, at different level, maybe only theological, maybe more broadly. And then there are those who are not. One of the scholars of the post-war church, the closed and open church, mentioned that. But Poland is one of the only countries in Europe that does, the Catholic Church devotes one day a year in January to the so-called Day of Judaism, a reflection on Jews and Judaism, and that's something that should be mentioned. Again, I think it's just a struggle in that way between different voices. I think we should see the...
All right, thank you so much.